Hey guys, in this section, I want to talk about the way that we use classical conditioning to essentially treat psychopathology. Now, in earlier lectures, we took a look at how we acquire different emotions, and we talked about how we use classical conditioning to induce conditioned emotional reactions. We started off with Pavlov working with drool, and then we went to John Watson and looked at the little Albert experiments and how he was able to take little Albert, essentially pair a rat with a loud noise, traumatize little Albert over about 6 pairings, and then little Albert was afraid of the rat. We can say with some good conviction that what he had done was induced a phobia in little Albert, particularly a rat phobia. And if we can use classical conditioning to induce a psychopathology, in this case a phobia, we can use classical conditioning to get rid of or treat that same condition. Now, remember, this is the simplest of all forms. As a matter of fact, phobias are the simplest of all anxiety-based disorders. The same underlying principles that drive phobias also drive post-traumatic stress disorder and borderline personality disorder, social phobia and panic disorders. All of them share the same underlying etiological cause, which is classical conditioning, pairing a conditioned stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus. So let me show you how this would work, how we would go about doing this. And all of the things that I'm going to talk about fall under the general heading of exposure therapies. Now, when we talk about exposure therapies, what we're doing is we're using a trick of classical conditioning, and that is we are exposing people to the feared stimulus or the anxiety-provoking or even just emotionally arousing stimulus. Let me draw this out for you real quick. If I can master my technology here. Please bear with me. This is all fairly new to me. Okay, so when we are looking at little Albert, for example, we can see where the conditioned stimulus was the rat, and the unconditioned stimulus was the noise. In both the conditioned and unconditioned stimuli, the reaction was fear. So in an exposure therapy paradigm, what we would have to do is figure out a way to expose little Albert to the conditioned stimulus and delink it from the unconditioned stimulus. So what you want to do is you want to present the rat without the noise. And when we do this, what we are doing is we are exposing the individual to the conditioned stimulus. Now, there are a few ways to do it. In your book or in clinical psychology, not just in your book, one of the ways that we do this, or a couple of ways that we can do this, is through systematic desensitization or flooding. Systematic desensitization is a way of exposing people to a feared stimulus. And this is not just for rat phobias. This is for all different kinds of evocative emotional stimuli that have been classically conditioned. It could be phobias, it could be fetishes, it could be fears and anxieties. And what we do is we teach people essentially how to relax in the face of their feared stimulus. Now remember, in a phobia or some kind of conditioned arousal setting, what we're doing is we are going to expose them to the rat. Well, they're already afraid of the rat. So how do we get them exposed to the rat without being exposed to that psychophysiological arousal? There are two approaches to this, or two components to systematic desensitization. The first is to create what we call a fear hierarchy. In this case, let's talk about a spider. Somebody's afraid of a spider, and what you have them do is create a fear hierarchy going from 0 to 100 and have maybe about 10 steps, going from just thinking about a spider to looking at a picture of a spider, and each subsequent step is a little bit more threatening. So the first thing you do is you have them fill this all out. And then you go into either imaginal or what we call in vivo. Imaginal is just imagining a spider. In vivo is actually having a spider with you. And you do this while the person is relaxed. And there are certain ways that you can get a person to relax. Probably the most common is a technique called progressive muscle relaxation, where you have people tense, relax, tense, and relax, different muscle groups until they're entirely relaxed. And then you start in with level number 1 from your fear hierarchy. And once you can go through level number 1 of your fear hierarchy, if they start to experience any stress, you have them lift a finger and then you back off, you have them relax, and then you go in and you do it again. And then you do it again until you can get through the entire level 1 without any kind of evocative stimulus. In that way, what you're essentially doing is you are, again, delinking the conditioned stimulus from the unconditioned stimulus. You are, in this case, it would be a spider, presenting them with a spider without the psychophysiological arousal that would be incumbent with the noise. So if we do this, we do it step by step, and eventually we work through level 1, then level 2, all the way up through level 10. Now remember, humans have these big bloated frontal lobes. We are the fiddler crabs of neurology, and it turns out that imagining the spider is almost as effective as having an actual spider. As a matter of fact, in some cases, it might even be a little bit more effective because the person isn't quite so threatened by it. And what we find is that when we go through each step by step, by the time in our imaginations we get to the highest rated or listed step in the fear hierarchy, they can actually go in and deal with a real spider without nearly any of the same level of psychophysiological arousal or fear or adrenaline, the stimulation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. This is useful for many, many different kinds of things, because what we're doing is we're using the RiskVogner model. Remember, when we use the RiskVogner model, it describes how much we can condition. In this case, the little Albert paired the rat with a noise, first time, second time, third, fourth, fifth, sixth time, until he was good and afraid of that rat, and the presentation of the rat made him afraid. Well, the RiskVogner model works in reverse as well. When you can expose somebody to the rat or the spider or a social situation or the trauma eliciting stimulus from their PTSD, what we find is that the extinction curve, the decrease in that fear, the decrease in that arousal, is essentially the mirror image of the acquisition curve. As a matter of fact, this is a process very often called counter conditioning, and it was invented by Joseph Wolpe in the 1950s, not for phobias, but because at the time most therapy was Freudian, and people coming back with battle fatigue or shell shock from the war were being ineffectively treated by psychoanalysis. They would lay on the couch and then they would talk about, their dreams and free association. And when he got them talking about the trauma in particular, their PTSD symptoms started clearing up much more rapidly. And from that, he was able to create this kind of exposure therapy. And that actually is the basis for almost all modern therapy that we have today. As a matter of fact, I am hard-pressed to think of any psychotherapy that we use that is not directly related to exposure in one way or another. As a matter of fact, when I'm training clinical psychologists, my most common phrase is find the open wound and poke your finger in it. Because what we have to do is get people aroused. We have to expose them to the distressing stimulus until they can handle it without that same level of distress. And if you do this in a systematic way, and there are many different kinds of therapies, but they all share this same underlying technique, exposure, you can get people to increase their functioning and decrease their distress in essentially all of the anxiety disorders, plus a wide range of other disorders that you would cover in an abnormal class rather than this class. So let me end here. And in the next topic, we'll take a look at still the implications of emotional functioning, but in the next section, we're going to take a look at how we develop prejudices and hate and how we can use these same techniques to actually deal with that.